Welcome to the program. I'm Joseph Wise with SJEN TV, coming to you on location from the Anaheim Convention Center, where the SCRC conference is fully underway. And I want to apologize in advance if you hear a bunch of ambience. This is a live conference going on, so there's going to be a lot of hooting and hollering, but we're not going to let that stop us from having a good time. And I'm very happy to introduce to the program today Richard Bonacci, who is with Faith-Based Communications.
That's correct.
And an expert on the Shroud of Turin and Eucharistic miracles. Richard, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. Very happy to be here.
Well, you know, you are part of a ministry that covers two things I love very most: the Shroud of Turin and Eucharistic miracles. But I want to know, first of all, how did you get involved with such a ministry like that?
That's a bit of a long story, but it basically goes all the way back to when I was in high school, and I had this little tiny pamphlet in my desk that I would take out frequently and read it about the Shroud of Turin. And then back in the late 1970s is when John Jackson did the Shroud of Turin research project with his team. And in the early 80s, he would go around the Denver area making presentations on the Shroud, and my wife and I would take our children to these presentations, and they were pretty fascinating. Then he opened the Turin Shroud Center in Colorado Springs. And again, we would take our children to his exhibit there, and he had the full-size copies of the Shroud of Turin, the natural colored ones, the black and white negatives, and all of this exhibit material, and it was just fascinating. And I said, you know, people need to be aware of this information about the Shroud. And I made an internal commitment back in the early 80s that I wanted to be able to take the image out on the road and bring it around to people around the country. And I wasn't even sure at that time if I'd ever even be able to get a life-size replica of the Shroud. And ended up having to wait about 30 years before we stopped adopting children, and they grew up and finally left home. So you know, this was about 30 years between the time I made that commitment and the time that the last one finally left home. And then I started putting together a presentation on the Shroud. It took a few months, and then started contacting parishes to see if they were interested in having me come, and I discovered that people were really interested in the Shroud during the Lenten season.
Yes,
but throughout the rest of the year, you know, there wasn't as much interest. And a couple of years before that, my wife and I had gone on a Eucharistic Miracles tour, and every place that we went doing research on the places we'd be visiting. I would check on the internet, find information about these miracle places, and kept coming back to the Real Presence organization's website, where they had all this information on all the different Eucharistic miracles. So when we started doing these presentations, what we wanted to do is bring faith-building experiences to parishes, and we said, well, something that would supplement the Shroud presentations for the rest of the year would be presentations on Eucharistic miracles. So I contacted the Real Presence, and they gave us permission to print the Vatican-sponsored Eucharistic Miracles of the World exhibit, and to take it around to parishes all over the country. So that's what we're doing. So now, during the Lenten season, we do probably 2/3 to 3/4 of our presentations on the Shroud, and the rest of the year we do about 75% of our presentations on Eucharistic miracles.
It's funny how those two have a season going right now, and here you are at the SCRC convention right now.
Right.
And you know, going deeper into the Shroud of Turin, you know, obviously for the Lenten season, people want to remember what the Lenten season is about, and there's the burial shroud of our Lord and Savior. But what I think is also incredible is that, you know, our religion, people like to say, oh, it's myth and fairy tales if they're atheistic, but for crying out loud, we have, you know, a first-class relic of, you know, the Lord himself, you know, blood there, you can see what he looked like. That's him. Right. And the Shroud of Turin has, like, you know, how many hours has it been examined by the scientific
over
community?
600,000 hours a decade ago by some of the best minds on the planet, trying to understand and explain this image that's on there. And despite all the best efforts of some of these great scientists, these physicists, they're yet to come up with an explanation of how the image was actually created, and to then try and be able to create an image that has the same characteristics as the image on the Shroud.
Yeah, because the big to-do was that they made a 3D image, or a 3D printout, if you will, of you know, using specifications from the Shroud to actually recreate Jesus kind of almost in a statue. But even, you know, then it's, you know, a little bit rough, so it's kind of like the Lord is still, like, perhaps trying to hide from us, even when he's giving us, you know, these, you know, if you're not a believer, a clue to his existence, and if you are a believer, then proof, you know?
Right. Yeah, actually, I have one of the VP8 image analyzers, which probably the last half dozen that exist in the world.
Yeah.
That I bring to the various parishes that we do presentations at.
Yeah.
And people that come through our exhibit are actually able to rotate the knobs, change the gain, change the rotation and the tilt of the image, because I have a live camera pointing at an image of the shroud, so they can see this three-dimensional characteristic being displayed in real time.
That is incredible.
Yeah.
And I remember that there was a controversy several years ago that they had gotten a sample of the shroud and they said, wait a minute, no, the material used for this dates to, like medieval Europe, and the fibers that were used is somewhere in Europe. This thing is a fake, but they discovered that that wasn't the case.
That's true, right? Because when they did the carbon dating in 1988, they said, well, the shroud came into existence, the fabric, sometime between 1260 and 1390.
Mm-hmm.
So when that report came out, everybody threw their hands up in disgust and said, well, we're dealing with a medieval fakery.
Yeah.
And all the money dried up to support the scientific research, and the people doing the research stopped. And then it was only as a result of people saying, well, gee, there's got to be something wrong, because all of the other data indicates it dates back to the 1st century and that it's authentic.
Yeah.
And I mean, if you look at it from purely a statistical perspective, how you do statistical analysis, the first thing you do when you collect data on any experiment is you look and see if there's some outliers. And if there's outliers, you throw away that data and then you analyze the rest of the stuff that's within 3 standard deviations of your mean.
Yeah, ignore the statistical abnormalities.
That's right. So in this case, what they did is they threw out 99% of the data and they focused on this one data point.
Isn't that typical how they treat the church?
Well, yes. I mean, you've got all these secular organizations that are trying to disprove the existence of God, trying to disprove anything associated that supports religious beliefs. Yeah. And they'll do anything to try and bury it. And
and the story that came out is that the shroud was actually damaged in a fire, I believe.
Yes, in 1532 in Chambray in France.
Yeah,
right.
So some good soul endeavored to repair it, but that meant that the repairing process, does that sound correct? Or?
Well, no, the damage that was done to the shroud from the fire was not associated with the repair that you're thinking of on the dating.
Gotcha.
However, from that fire, there would have been a new carbon that would have been deposited on the cloth that would have shifted the carbon-14 date.
Yeah.
But dating of cloths using carbon-14 is not as accurate as you might expect. For example, if they've dated Egyptian mummies, and they've dated the mummy and then the cloth that's wrapping the mummy, and they've come up with a difference of 1,700 years between the two.
That's a very substantial amount of time between the two.
Yeah, they've taken new cloths that known to be new and sent it to the same laboratories testing the shroud, and they come back with very old dates. They take materials that are known to be old, and they come back with new dates.
Yeah.
And because there's so many things that can influence and change the results of the carbon-14 test when you're dealing with cloths.
Yeah.
But there's lots of new types of tests that have been applied to the shroud. Most recently, just a few years ago, Giulio Fanti in Italy published a book in which they had done 3 new tests at 6 international laboratories using new techniques, using dated fibers. And in the case of those experiments, they found that the average of the 3 tests was the year 33 BC plus or minus 125 years at the 95% confidence level. Okay?
Jeez.
Yeah, even the testing that was done with the carbon-14 test, if you look at the raw data and do a normal statistical analysis, you just subject it to people that are statisticians and you ask them to analyze the data, they're going to come up with completely different results than what they did in the official carbon-14 test, because they were fudging the data to try and get the results that they wanted.
Yeah.
Even if you look at the carbon-14 test and compare the 2 of the laboratories, I think it's Arizona and Zurich.
Yeah.
If you compare those 2 tests at the 95% confidence level using just the data from those tests, it tells you that those 2 samples were different materials.
Funny how that works, isn't it? Jeez. And I want to apologize once again to our audience. We are live on location at the Anaheim Convention Center with SCRC, and there is a little bit of ambience, but it's all praise and worship, so do forgive them. They are only rendering the Lord his is due praise and worship. I want to switch gears now to Eucharistic miracles,
All right.
because that's another very beautiful thing that the Lord has given us, and something that we can participate every day in if we want to, and every Sunday if we're a good Catholic. And the Eucharist itself is a miracle, but there has been miracles on top of miracles with the Eucharist. I think one of the ones that I know of the most is blood and heart tissue showing up
Yes.
inside the Eucharist. Of all the Eucharistic miracles that you have studied and displayed there, do you have one that's your favorite, or the one that you think is the one that everyone should know about as the quintessential, if you can say that about a miracle?
Yeah, I mean, the miracle that took place in Lanciano around the year 750 is probably one of the most famous Eucharistic miracles.
Yeah.
It begins with the doubting priest, as many of these miracles do.
Yeah.
And of course the host transformed into heart tissue and the wine turned into blood, and was witnessed by everyone who was there present at Mass that day.
Yeah.
And like I said, that's the most famous one. And there have been many Eucharistic miracles that have taken place just in the last 20 years
Yeah.
in city after city after city, whereby the host is changing into heart tissue.
Yeah.
And in these cases, they've gone through very, very extensive scientific investigation of the sacred species associated with these miracles. The samples that were provided to the scientists did not know that it was associated with the alleged Eucharistic miracles. And in each case, they're coming up and they're saying, well, it is, in fact, heart tissue. And I have cardiologists that come up to me when I'm doing presentations and go through the exhibit, and they look at the photographs and they say, well, I can look at that. I know what I'm looking at is heart tissue. And then you have the white blood cells that are present in these samples that would die within 15 minutes of being taken out of a human body, yet they're alive years after these miracles have taken place. And heart tissue that would normally die within 48 hours of being taken from our body, and it's there for months and years after these miracles have taken place. And like in one of the miracles that took place in Tixla in Mexico, 4 years after the start of this Eucharistic miracle, where the blood has come to the surface of the host, it's coming from the interior of the host. It's not something that was placed on the surface of the host.
Yeah.
And 4 years after the start of the miracle, they can detect the presence of fresh blood that's beneath the surface of the host.
Underneath the
Right.
skin,
Yeah.
in the veins.
Yeah.
How about
Yeah,
that?
in Sokoka, Poland, just like 10 years ago, you have a host that was dissolved in water, but it did not completely dissolve.
Yeah.
And it gradually transformed into heart tissue. But what's amazing is when you look at the photograph of this particular host, you have a section of the host that is still the bread form, and the rest of the host that is transformed into heart tissue. And the scientists and the medical professionals, they look at this and they say, well, there's absolutely no way that any scientist or doctor could create what we're looking at here, because it's all tightly interconnected. The heart tissue is tightly interconnected with the bread substance.
As Catholics, we would call that consubstantiation.
Absolutely. Or transubstantiation.
Transubstantiation.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's been a long day. I want to apologize again. But anyway, but it's kind of funny that most of these Eucharistic miracles begin with a doubting priest.
Very often.
Because I think of St. Thomas doubting the resurrection of Christ. And it's like, unless if I put my hands into his hand and his side, I won't believe.
Yeah.
And Jesus shows up and says, go ahead, do it.
Right.
And so I think all these priests are kind of like St. Thomas in that they have a doubt or an insecurity, and God in his mercy will make himself known to them in a very intimate way and through the Eucharist. So more or less, they get to put their hands into his side and into the heart through the Eucharist that bleeds and has a heart.
Yeah, and I make a point of that during my presentations too.
Yeah.
That we don't want to be like doubting Thomases.
No, unless if you really, really want to, but
Yeah.
be prepared to be scared out of your wits if it's revealed to you that this is Christ fully manifest.
What's fascinating is, we go all over the country doing these presentations, and in nearly every parish that we visit, someone comes up to me after my presentation and tells me about the Eucharistic miracles that they've experienced.
Oh.
Yeah, so we're hearing these miracle stories everywhere that we go, and there's no end to it. Of course, you mentioned the transubstantiation.
Transubstantiation, yeah.
When we were talking about these really special Eucharistic miracles, but these special Eucharistic miracles go way beyond transubstantiation, because within the definition of that, it tells us that there is no change. It's going to look and taste like bread and wine before and after the consecration, whereas we're talking about something that goes beyond transubstantiation.
Yeah, and I mean, just with how closely woven it is, you know? Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
You know, when you think like that, it's might be a little bit of mercy that because of transubstantiation, it still tastes like bread and wine afterwards, you know?
Yeah, but you asked about my favorite Eucharistic miracle. Okay, it's not one that involves, heart tissue and whatever, which, of course, are very convincing to people who don't understand and believe in the true presence of Jesus. But my favorite miracle is actually in the category of reverent animal behaviors, because there's nothing that you can do to influence the animals. You know, you can promise them money, wealth, power. It's not going to have any impact on them. They're just going to do what comes natural.
Yeah.
So I have this priest in Albaroya in Spain, and he has some sick parishioners. So he's going to take the Eucharist to them. So he gets a ciborium, places some consecrated hosts in it, gets on his donkey, and heads off in the direction of their homes. So he has to cross a river, and as they're crossing the river, the donkey slips and the priest falls off. Lid falls off the ciborium. The hosts fall into the river.
Oh no.
And the priest is there in the river just thrashing about, trying to recover things, but the current has taken everything away. So the next thing he knows, he hears some fishermen that are downstream, and they're yelling to him, say, Father, Father, you've got to come here and see this. There's these fish. They're mostly out of the water, and they're holding these little white discs in their mouth. The priest doesn't even bother to go investigate. He heads back to the church to get another ciborium. While he's gone, the city is there at the edge of the river. Word of mouth spreads. The entire town collects. They're all watching the fish holding these little white discs out of the water. The priest comes back with the ciborium, goes over to the edge of the river, kneels down. The fish come over one by one and drop the host in the ciborium, and he's able to recover them.
Even creation knows its creator.
That's
How
right.
about that? I love that.
Yeah.
There was a story I was told when I was very little to that point, and I was so little when I was told this story, but it was a Catholic saint who was arguing with an atheist, and he goes, I'm going to starve my horse for 2 days. You come over, have a host, and I'll have a bag of grain.
Yeah, well, we're talking about St. Anthony of Padua.
St. Anthony of Padua, there we go.
And it's in Rimini, in Italy.
Yeah.
And it was a mule for 3 days. It was locked up in the barn.
Yeah.
And because he had been trying to convert this heretic, that's what he was famous for, is working with the heretics. And he was trying to convert him. And the heretic says, well, I can believe everything you've taught me about the Christian faith except for one thing. I can't believe that Jesus would make himself present in this little wafer of bread. So they entered into this agreement like you talked about.
Yeah.
Locked up the mule for 3 days, at the end of which the mule comes out. The heretic is there with fodder to feed his mule. St. Anthony is there with the monstrance with the Blessed Sacrament. The mule comes out, ignores the food, goes over and kneels down before the Blessed Sacrament.
Bows down, yeah.
So he became a very, very zealous convert to the Catholic faith.
You know, you can't fix something like that.
No.
You know, you can't. But I got to tell you, my favorite Eucharistic miracles have all been in Eucharistic adoration. And, you know, I have a lot of friends who, you know, are getting ready to get married, and they have a wife who's not yet a believer, but they want to believe, and they keep on going to Eucharistic adoration time and time again. But then they finally hear, like a week or two before the wedding, that, you know, the wife-to-be is in tears, because after all that time in front of the Eucharist, they finally recognized that God was there, and through the Eucharist, he spoke to them, and the first thing that they heard was how much that they were loved, and that was enough to melt them into tears. You know, and I've also kind of experienced that in Eucharistic adoration.
I was experiencing this just a few minutes ago, and I was talking to this woman that's here participating in the conference, and she's a former, she's a convert from Islam.
Oh my goodness.
And she said what brought her into the Catholic faith was her experience with the Eucharist. And she said that every time she felt like praying, she would go into the church. And at one point, she decided to figure out, well, what church was she going into? So she, drew herself a little map of all these churches that she had gone to, and every one of them was Catholic. And she started researching it and ended up converting to Catholicism. So
incredible.
Yeah, and she's in tears, so she's telling me this story.
Oh, God bless her.
Yeah.
So for those who are interested in possibly having you come over to do a presentation, or if they want to get involved with the Faithful Communications, was it?
Faith-based communications.
Faith-based communications. Yeah. How can they get involved? How can they contact you?
Okay, well, there's two ways. You can call us at our phone number,
Gotcha.
which is 775-720-4519.
Gotcha.
Or they can go to our website, which is faithbasedcomm.com. The first comm is COMM.
COMM.
Right.
There we go.
Okay.
Is there anything else that you would like to part with before we go our way?
If people are interested in having us go to their parishes,
Yes.
their schools, we do a lot of schools, religious communities. There's absolutely no charge, no reimbursement expenses. We don't take up a goodwill collection. We don't sell anything for profit.
Oh my goodness.
Okay.
You guys have to be pretty serious about this.
Right.
That's awesome. You know what? God bless you and all that you do. And thank you very much for your time, sir.
Enjoyed meeting you. Thank you.
Likewise. All right, more SCRC conference coming at you. Don't go away.